Welcome to Creative Communities. My name is Daniel and I'm just doing the introductory bit. I'm here amongst the cherry blossoms of Keele University introducing our recording from day 3 of Creative Communities Series 1. We have Georgia Thomas-Parr from University of Sheffield and she delivered an amazing talk, Girlhood and Cosplay, which I hope you'll enjoy. Thank you so much to Georgia for doing this event with us, and thank you also to the AHRC's NWCDTP for helping to support this series of events. Without further ado, enjoy.
Girlhood refers to the period and experience of being a girl, and cosplay is a term to refer to costume role play, and this is associated with sci-fi, anime, and gaming fandom, and becoming increasingly popular as a result of the internet in the 21st century. So during my research between 2017 and 2019, pre-pandemic, look how many people there are, I attended anime conventions up and down the country where I interviewed and observed cosplayers and anime fans on their experiences. So anime conventions are places where fans of anime come together to celebrate their passion, and cosplay is one of the activities that is so popular as part of the convention scene. And it was during this time that I saw a proliferation of one type of cosplay being performed, namely girls. I saw many groups and individuals cosplaying as girls from anime series and other types of Japanese popular culture. Girls were everywhere, from the popular Vocaloid, Hatsune Miku, idol franchise Love Live, and then there's Sailor Moon, and of course the popular character from Danganronpa, Junko. There were girls everywhere. It was very popular. And these are just a few examples, but I became really interested in how cosplayers cosplaying as girls were particularly visible in a convention context. And I began to think about what significance this might have, particularly how the symbolic girl in Japanese media and culture becomes manifest via cosplay. And what might this signify? So this is what I'm going to focus on in today's presentation, how the figure of the symbolic girl is evoked through cosplay. So I'm talking symbolically here, so I'm not talking about the lived experiences of girls, but rather girl impersonators. And as a symbol, the girl is both subversive and liminal. So what do these terms both mean? Subversion is the ability to undermine something, and liminality is the ability to be between states. So girls such as Alice are liminal because they're seen to exist between childhood and adulthood, and they occupy a temporal space that exists between these states and sort of outside chronological time. And this is something that cosplayers tap into when they cosplay as certain girl figures such as Alice. So stereotypically, girls are seen as sweet and innocent, which lends itself to subversion, where the stereotype of her innocence and sweetness becomes undermined. This is why the scene from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is so creepy, because the girl as a symbol is subversive, so it allows her to undermine her own stereotypical innocence. And this is something that is done particularly in Japanese culture. So we'll see this in examples such as baby metal and J-fashion. So baby metal, the three members, they started the band when they were aged 11 to 13, and they worked to undermine the genre of heavy metal as being something that is associated with maybe masculinity or darkness. And then you've got this image of J-fashion here, where you can see the two J-fashionistas using this image of the girl-like doll and then subverting it to make it uncanny and eerie and a bit creepy. We might also observe this symbolism of uncanny girlhood coming through Japanese pop culture icon Kyary Pamyu Pamyu in her music video Pom Pom Pom. So she uses girlishness to create a cute and subversive backdrop in her style and music video. So for example, we'll see crows flying out of her mouth, eyeballs floating around her. These types of things are very eerie and they contribute to her subversive image as a girl. And then in this screenshot, she's dueling with a clock, which further contributes to this image of the girl existing outside time. So the point is the symbol of the girl is particularly visible in a Japanese context, and her properties or characteristics are elements that cosplayers tap into when they cosplay as girls. So when you cosplay as a girl, you evoke her symbolism, which is both liminal and subversive. So as I'm going to argue today in this presentation, cosplayers can use the symbolism of the girl to undermine and evade constricting social structures. So that's the basis I'm working with for this presentation today. And there's one particular rising phenomenon of cosplay that I would like to discuss, in which the symbol of the girl is specifically embedded. Maid cafe cosplay. Yes, it is time that we demystified maid cafes away from a patriarchal gaze and looked at them from the perspectives of the maids themselves, who are curiously girl-like. Bearing in mind this is a huge topic to talk about, and there's only so much time that I can cover it as best as I can. So I'm looking at a general view of maid cafes, but maid cafes really can't be generalized. So do bear with me, and if there's anything that needs clearing up, you can ask it in the Q&A, I'm sure. But I'd say the one element that can be generalized with maid cafes is the symbol of girlhood, which comes through. So that's what this talk's about. Okay, so now we're into the main body of this presentation. I'll map out what I'll be talking about. So first, I'll define what maid cafes are and how they relate to cosplay. Then I'll look at how the symbolism of the girl is evoked through maid cafes and how this links to kawaii subculture, which I will also define. And then I will look into two specific areas where girlhood is particularly apparent in maid cafe cosplay. And finally, I will observe what this might indicate about femininity and its existence in a UK context. So let's get into it now with a brief overview of maid cafes. Who, what, where, when, kawaii. I'm not sure actually how to use this function, but I was going to ask, has anyone here been to a maid cafe? Wave at me if you have, but I can't actually press the button. So feel free to mention it in the chat as well. So I'll be covering this, what happened in maid cafes and a brief history of it. Maid cafes originated from Japan, and they're becoming increasingly popular as a result of the internet, like cosplay itself and anime fandom. For the most part, maid cafes in the UK are influenced by the Japanese chain maid cafes such as At Home and Maid Dreaming. So as you can see that they're here, that's the aesthetic they're working for, and they're very much popular in Japan. Maid cafes and anime fandom go hand in hand. So having maid cafes at anime conventions are becoming more and more common. And that's how I came across them in my research. So I interviewed maid cafe cosplayers and I observed them, and I became a maid cafe cosplayer myself. And through this, I came across various different realizations as part of my research. First of all, not all maid cafes are the same. So there are many nuances and differences between each maid cafe, particularly in the UK. So this is just a handful of maid cafes that are available. To my knowledge, there aren't any maid cafes in Wales or Northern Ireland as of yet. So the first maid cafe opened up in Japan in 2001, whereas the first maid cafe in the UK was just 10 years later, and they're becoming gradually more popular. And the first maid cafe in Japan gave customers the opportunity to interact with characters in 3D. I should also mention that butlers also play a role in maid cafes in UK maid cafes. So there's often a shared role between maids and butlers, whereas in Japan they're a bit more separate. So you'd have a separate butler cafe and a separate maid cafe. But I won't be talking much about butlers today, just maids. So the maid cafes that I observed in the UK were founded by cosplayers and anime fans, as opposed to being lucrative businesses on the same scale as Japan. And in fact, many of the maid cafes in the UK were volunteer or charity projects. British maid cafes are not the same as Japanese maid cafes in the sense that they're not established businesses open to the general public every single day, but they're rather passion projects by anime fans for anime fans. And they happen within the confines of an anime convention, or if at a pre-booked event, there'll be you have to pre-book your ticket, so it's generally not open to the general public. And there's a reason for this. Conventional British culture is largely not conducive to maid cafes or their image. And why is this? Because in a UK context, the maid is generally read as a figure of fetishization and erotic desire. However, this is not the case for the maid cafes that I observed both in Japan and the UK. So as one participant that I spoke to told me, a lot of our parents will see the costumes and they'll immediately think that it's something fetishy. They don't understand because they can't see it beyond a UK viewpoint where everything a girl or woman does is supposed to be sexual. And this was a sentiment that came through in many of the conversations that I had with the maids. It was almost like they were coming from a different viewpoint, which more widely in the UK, people just didn't see the same way. So sexualization is normatively a tribute to femininity in our society, which it partly explains its demonization in a maid cafe context. So even though the games and mangas based on maid cafes, which originated, so that's in the top right corner, that's the game Welcome to Pia Carrot. And so these influenced the first maid cafes that came about in Japan, where fans of these series could meet the maids in real life. So even though they may or may not have been framed around eroticism, what's fundamental to note is that the sensibilities and services that emerged from these cafes were and are not sexual. And this was stated by Patrick Galbraith, and he did his ethnography on Japanese maid cafes. To my knowledge, no one's done any studies on maid cafes in the UK as of yet, or even globally. So I'm hoping to change that. So this is not to say that maid cafes, seedy maid cafes do not exist, or that there are no cases of eroticization in maid cafe context globally. Rather, what I'm going to suggest is that we look at maid cafes through a different lens of resonation and intention. The intention surrounding maid cafes in Japan and the UK is not intended as erotic, and these intentions and resonations are framed around the aesthetic and sensibility of kawaii and symbolic girlhood, which I'll get into in a bit. The point is, maid cafes have been appropriated from a seemingly patriarchal origin for the purposes of a non-erotically oriented feminine subculture in the UK. And all of the maids that I spoke to asserted that their cosplay and maid uniforms were not to be seen as sexual, but rather cute. That was their intention, and that was the resonation of the environment that the maid cafe garnered. In order to properly understand this resonation of maid cafes, we must first understand the concept of kawaii and how it relates to symbolic girlhood in a Japanese context. So kawaii is the term for cute in Japanese, and it's often colourful, characterful, soft and excessive, and often related to the world of consumer girlhood. Anything can be kawaii and anything can be kawaiified, just as these Hello Kitty toilet accessories on the left illustrate. And then on the right, this is Banana, an anime about a cat who lives in a banana, and I definitely recommend it. You also see it in Kyori Pamyu, who is a figure of kawaii too. Kawaii, just like girlhood, can be excessive and subversive too. So kawaii and girlhood are interlinked and have many connections. And this is reflected in maid cafe customs, where the symbol of the maid, regardless of how you might perceive her, is kawaiified, effectively subverting any eroticism that might be attributed to her image from outsiders. Kawaii manifests itself in multiple ways in maid cafes, whether it's cute faces and animals in the food, or the decorations and aesthetic of the maid cafe, and even the actual maids themselves, who are the embodiment of kawaii in girl form. The point of the maid cafe and its maid is to create an environment of cuteness and kawaii, and to evoke feelings of moe in the customer. And that's another concept that you need to understand in order to properly understand maid cafes. So moe, in simple terms, it refers to an effectual response to something kawaii or cute. So you'd have the kawaii objects, and then its cuteness would move you so much to the extent that you would feel compelled to say moe, which is it's like an epiphany of cuteness, except instead of saying eureka, you say moe. So the maid cosplaying as an imaginary girl inspired by anime is a figure of kawaii who evokes moe. Maid cafes were so compelling to me because I saw them as drawing together these two concepts of girlhood and cosplay in intriguing ways. Are maid cafes cosplay though? And I would say definitely they are. Maid cafes come under the rubric of cosplay because its members are essentially cosplaying as archetypal characters inspired by anime and manga. So in this image, you can see the three maids, and they're dressed up as these imaginary characters on either side of them. Maids come out of this image of archetypal anime girls, and that's what they're performing as. Cosplay is also an imaginary space, and this links to what Susan Napier terms the fantasy-scape, as a place where we lose our real-world identities and engage with fantasy ones. Maid cafes are ultimately places of imagination, fantasy, and escapism. Therefore, I'd say maid cafes are definitely cosplay cafes. And when we can approach maid cafes from the perspectives of cosplay, then I believe that this can help demystify them and demonize them as well. So we have this intriguing phenomenon of maid cafe culture and kawaii sensibilities being adopted within a UK context, but being culturally misread by people in the UK who aren't aware of kawaii culture. And what I suggest is that maid cafe cosplay allows us to turn the spotlight and the onus back on the objectifier and actively question the fact that femininity has been made synonymous with sexualization. And the way in which this is achieved is through evoking the uncanny kawaii, the image of uncanny kawaii and liminal girlhood. So as I mentioned earlier, maid cosplayers are girl impersonators, and by far the majority of maid cafe cosplayers I met were age 18 and over, and it was generally a rule for them to be over the age of 18 in order to join a maid cafe, which is ironic given the fact that it's usually a characteristic of some maid cafes for their members and their personas to be age forever 17. So these maid cosplayers are performing a girlhood that is perpetually on the cusp of coming of age, whereas they themselves are legally adults. So as I mentioned before, maid cafe cosplayers are therefore girl impersonators, which led me to create a term as a way of observing maid cafe culture: girl drag. So some of you may be aware of RuPaul's Drag Race, where drag characterizes and exaggerates gender to comedic effect. Drag is femininity or gender without consequences, and like cosplay, drag is a mask that can be taken off. However, girl drag differs from conventional drag, given the fact that the performances are distinctly girlish and immature, as opposed to, say, a generalized stereotype of the drag queen that might be viewed as mature or sensuous. Regardless, maid cafe cosplayers are excessive and drag-like in performance and aesthetic, which is what lends them so well to the term girl drag. And on top of this, as I mentioned before, maids create their own personas. So rather than cosplaying as specific characters from anime, you design your own character as a maid, and that's what you perform as, which is also something that's done in drag. So here, cosplayers can behave like girls without consequences, and it's an opportunity to regress to the in-between state of symbolic girlhood, where the consequences of adult femininity do not exist. So let's look into how maid cafe cosplayers achieve drag in two ways, and that's aesthetic and performance. So the dress and aesthetic is ultimately girly, and you see the consumerism of kawaii coming through. So if you look at their dresses, there's lots of frills and bows. In the top right corner, that's Hitomi. She's the president of At Home Cafe. And you can see she's got like a kawaii charm on her headband. And then also the maid dress itself, it's layered up with petticoats to make it puff out, which gives the maid silhouette a doll-like shape to it. So effectively, the more doll-like you appear as a maid, the more this kawaii, ethereal, liminal, subversive girlhood can come through and transport the customers to this different world, this different dimension. Then there's the performances. Many maid cafe cosplayers have a character that they perform, which relates to tropes of anime characters. So I mentioned that before. So we've got two images here. We've got Maid in Scotland at the bottom right. They're doing a performance dancing. So there's often acting and dancing, which is part of the maid the Maid Cafe ambience. And then in the top left, we have May and Maid Cafe. And I thought it was quite interesting because they had a divide along the middle between the two types of maids that they would have. So they'd have a light side and a dark side. And light side maids would generally be sweet and genteel, and the dark side maids would be sassy and villainous. So you see this different subversion of girlhood and sweetness and innocence, and really playing around with that concept coming through here. Another thing that I found is that maids can act as exaggerated as they like, and it's generally a characteristic of maid cosplayers to be infantile and girly ultimately, because this adds to the fantasy and illusion of girlhood and kawaii anime-ness that they're evoking. So some of the maids that I met, they were sweet, innocent, angelic, or there were other ones who were rude, naive, stupid, and demonic, or some of them who were those all at the same time. The point is, in maid cosplay, you can be as flawed as you like, and it's actively applauded by the customers who enjoy this characterization of kawaii anime girl likeness that you're presenting. So as another participant told me, when I'm a maid, I feel like I can be cute and goofy, which is such a freeing feeling to be able to express myself without the usual pressures from society to be mature or cool or sexy. So yeah, I thought this really resonated with the atmosphere that I felt in going into maid cafes, contrary to how they're perceived from outsiders who aren't aware of what they are. The Maid Cafe, in all its kawaii cuteness, is visibly a polar opposite to the world of socialized adulthood. And going to a maid cafe is the opportunity to be doted on like a child and escape the burden of being a grown-up. So I thought I'd share a video with you now, and this is from At Home. And as I show it, I want you to look out for these elements of kawaii-ness and how girlhood is coded in it. Okay, so that's enough of that. So yeah, watching this video, you see various things coming through, just how kawaii it is with the different coloured bows, the coloured foods and the coloured bunting. And what's interesting to note is that this video by At Home in Japan will evoke a feeling of moe in those that watch it, and those who don't get the sort of the kawaii aesthetic of maid cafes might have a different feeling towards it. But I really recommend approaching it from this sensibility of kawaii in order to really get into the heart of maid cafes and understand them. So yeah, this is a dance by At Home, and it's one of the rituals of maid cafes to have a dance performance within the maid cafe itself, both in Japan and the UK. And you might have noticed the moe kyun. So that was part of the song where moe refers to moe, as I mentioned, and kyun is another onomatopoeic word which refers to the feelings of butterflies in the stomach. So yes, the maid cafe is an effectual place which is supposed to evoke these feelings. So where else would performing this way be acceptable in a conventional UK context? At a certain age, like once we reach a certain age, performing as a girl becomes off limits or fetishized. And cosplay and kawaii subculture brings us access to acting feminine and girly in a way without the expectation of sexualization. So I thought I'd share one final testimony, and this was by Abby. And she said, in the West, we all focus on the changing of age and how you need to be. Again, it's the sexiness thing. You need to be an object. You need to be like a woman, an adult, and all of that shit. You need to stop wearing pigtails when you're not 7 anymore. Any age before that, fine. Any age after that, it's a fetish. We absolutely fetishize everything. And I'm not saying that Japan don't. They do. They just fetishize things in a different way. They've got room in their culture for adult women to be cute and separately be sexy. We don't have that at home. As many pointed out to me, there's little room in the UK for a feminine presenting person to not be sexualized or seen as a sexual object once they reach a certain age. And girlhood or childhood is the only period which is relatable to freedom from having to be a reproductive member of society, whether this is through financial labor and having to be productive in that sense, or towards this ideal of the heteronormative nuclear family, which we're all expected to participate in. Cosplaying as a girly maid, by contrast, is a way of escaping that socialized reality just for a little bit. And it allows you to tap into this symbolic imagery of the uncanny girl, and you can revel in an improvised environment where there aren't any consequences for your character. So to briefly summarize this presentation, the symbol of the girl carries subversion and liminality, which is the ability to undermine something and be in between structures. Cosplayers evoke these qualities when they cosplay as girls, particularly in a kawaii aesthetic. Maid cafe cosplay is distinctly kawaii and girl-like and a form of girl drag. And it can be used to undermine the unquestionable sexualization that femininity undergoes once it reaches a certain age. So here's a question I want to leave you with. We live in a world where girls and women encounter sexualization on a regular basis. But what if you could attempt to create an environment where femininity can flourish away from a denigrating and predatory gaze? Maid cafes in the UK are at least created with that intention. The point isn't whether or not maid cafe maids are seen as sexually desirable by outsiders. The point is how maid cafes operate as spaces where individuals feel motivated to participate, specifically because they see it as being an opportunity to present as feminine while avoiding sexualization. And this is achieved through performing the symbolism of the girl through cosplay. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to answering any questions that I'm sure you may have. And here's some references if you're interested.